Hello friends of paperbound knowledge transfer. Welcome to another review on my channel. The title of today's book is Hell to Pay, Operation Downfall and the Invasion of Japan 1945 to 1947 by Giangreco. This book was recently recommended to me by one of my subscribers. Because it was one of the first books recommended to me by a subscriber, I immediately decided to go and buy it and do a review about it. This is for you. This book is a very detailed look at the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands at the end of World War II. Those operations were never carried out, but they remain the topic of heated discussion till today because the decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan was partially based upon the expected casualty figures that the Americans expected to have in these invasion operations of Japan, which is also why the casualty question is quite central to this book. In general, the book is a more military-minded look at the proposed operations in Japan. The political perspective is mentioned and discussed, but only regarding its repercussions and its impact on the planning and the execution of those operations. It is also important to note that I have read and I am now reviewing the first Naval Institute Press edition of this book, which was published in 2020 and has 2 new chapters as compared to the 2009 original version of this book. So let's now have a closer look at the book in question. So let us now have a closer look at the contents of the book. The basic structure of the book is provided by 19 chapters, plus an epilogue, and the very extensive appendices A through to D. 2 of those chapters, the chapter about the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the chapter about the idea of a small Soviet invasion of Hokkaido, are new to this edition, so were not included in the earlier edition. Each chapter starts with 1 or 2 quotes out of a report or out of what somebody said, which then kind of lead over to what is to be expected or what is the topic of this chapter and what is to come in it. In those chapters, many different single and interrelated aspects regarding the planned landings on Japan are examined in detail. Aspects discussed are, for example, the role that kamikaze units or the topography in the landing areas would have played and what the impact of those things and aspects would have been on the fighting on Japan and on the sea of Japan. What I didn't know, for example, was how and to what extent the Japanese militarists planned to employ the civilian population to fend off the American invasion, and how many people they were willing to sacrifice in these operations, as well as what kind of conduct that would have generated from the Americans. So seeing civilians attacking you all the time would of course have changed their attitude to civilians somewhat, and that would have been quite bad, I think, for everyone involved, and would have led to quite a big casualty number on both sides. Because many aspects of the book, or discussed in the book, are interconnected, the author often mentions information multiple times in different chapters. One recurring theme is the question: what kind of casualty estimates for a landing were produced by the Americans at what point in time, and which leaders, military political, knew about those figures and used those figures at what point in time. Roughly the entire second half of the book, so some 260 pages out of the total of 550, is then taken up by the appendices, the sources and the index. The appendices consist of an abridged or two abridged reports which are reprinted in an abridged shorter version about the planned invasion in Kyushu. Those were intelligence reports produced by the American Army, as well as the Potsdam Declaration and a report by General MacArthur about the Operation Blacklist, which was the military occupation of Japan, which was of course done after the Japanese surrender. If this book is even half right, and the information even half right in this book, then an invasion of Japan would have been an apocalyptic event. I think that's the only conclusion you can draw from all that I've read in this book, and there's a lot in it. There would indeed have been hell to pay by everyone involved. So now for the positive and negative points of the book for me. At first, the negative points, and I didn't like that the book feels somewhat disorganized. It feels a bit like the different chapters maybe originally were articles in a magazine or something that were put out independently of each other. So as I already said, a lot of information is reiterated time and time again, and it doesn't feel like there is one kind of narrative or one line of thinking, one story that is told throughout the book. And that, yeah, it's a bit confusing, or for me at least was a bit confusing while I was reading the book. Then one point that I didn't quite like, or which was a bit strange for me, was that the book ended so suddenly. So you are at half the book and suddenly it just stops. There's just an appendice there, which is okay, it's interesting, but it's just the normal service, the normal book is just over and you've got half your book still, and that was quite strange. I was thinking, okay, strange. And one last point is that the paperback version of this book is quite fragile. So mine already has a few points where it doesn't look so great, and I had to tape it in one point, so that is not that nice, but of course it also brings down the price, and I can understand that point. Now for the positive aspects. The negative aspect, that the appendices are so big, is also, or can also be turned into a positive aspect, which is that it contains those original reports, which are interesting and give an insight into what the Americans really thought about the invasion before it happened, and before they knew all the facts from what they were told afterwards by the Japanese and all the other stuff that they did. The book also includes the human side of things, so there are some, not overly, but some reports of or eyewitness accounts of people. For example, one guy trained for being an anti-tank mine, so he trained for himself being an anti-tank mine, a Japanese. He would have thrown himself under an American tank if the need had arisen. That was quite chilling, I think. And yeah, brings home the human side of this operation. And the book, what I really liked is also that the book showed me that the American leaders and the British leaders, so the Allied leaders, really thought the entire World War II as a whole. So they were already influencing events in the last month of the conflict in Europe, when they were in Germany, when they were fighting in Germany. They were already restraining their units and saying, hey, don't push too far, don't take too many casualties, because we will need people for the invasion of Japan in a few months' time. So that the Americans didn't go to Berlin was also down to them not wanting to lose too many people, because they would need them in Japan later on. And that's something I didn't know, and that's an interconnection I didn't know anything about, which is fascinating. Mainly about the book in total, I like that so many new for me topics are talked about, and issues with amphibious operations against Japan at that point are raised. like the terrain conditions, the climate, and also cultural differences between the combatants. So what do you think is a victory? An American thought that victory was a different thing to what a Japanese imperialist officer might think. So very many different aspects, too many to talk about all of them, but in total very, very interesting and good stuff. So, final verdict. I think this book has its flaws, but is still a very interesting and detailed look at many new and very interesting aspects of those possible invasions. It certainly sharpened my knowledge about this topic a lot. But this book is not really something for an unexperienced reader or for somebody who comes into this topic without any prior knowledge about the Second World War in the Pacific and the last few months of the war in the Pacific and around Japan. So I would mostly recommend this book for an already experienced reader and somebody who has already read maybe a bit about this topic and now wants to go more into detail on the military questions surrounding the landing and also the casualty figures which are thrown around. For everybody else, I will recommend a few other books in a second. My reading suggestions for people who want to get a more base understanding of this topic are two. The first one to get an overview about the Japanese history between 1936 and 1945, so in the period that the Second World War is broadly concerned with, is the book The Rising Sun, The Decline and Fall of Japanese Empire between 1936 and 1945 by John Toland. It's an all-around view on all the aspects concerned of or with the Japanese Empire in that time. It gives a nice overview about what happened, what kind of decisions they were making and what repercussions that had. The second book, more concerned with the end of the Second World War, is the book Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire by Richard B. Frank. In difference to this book, to the book Hell to Pay, he also looks at political dimensions and more what the Japanese were thinking, what the Americans were thinking and so on. So it's a more all-round picture of the last months of the Second World War and the Japanese capitulation. So, thank you for watching and have fun reading.